Two fake HOA enforcers pepper-sprayed a blind 74-year-old woman on her own porch, then laughed as they walked away. Their scheme, backed by a smug HOA president with private ties, seemed untouchable. But they didn't know her son was the newly sworn-in Attorney General of Florida. Just wait until you see how this quiet act of cruelty unraveled, and why justice, in the end, came knocking hard. Sunday mornings on Pinebrook Lane were usually marked by the soft hum of lawnmowers, the distant bark of dogs, and the shuffle of retirees picking up newspapers barefoot in their driveways. Martha Ellison's porch, shaded by wind chimes and potted begonias, had always been a peaceful place, a quiet corner of the world she had nurtured for over 30 years. Martha was 74. She was legally blind, relying on a slender white cane and a sharply tuned sense of rhythm and space to navigate her modest home. Her late husband had built the porch swing himself. The neighbors knew her as gentle, polite, and meticulous, someone who still sent handwritten cards every Christmas. That morning she was simply sipping tea and listening to the radio when it all changed. The footsteps came fast and heavy. Two men, tall and broad, marched across her lawn without a word of greeting. They wore black cargo pants, matching polos stitched with the letters HOA Enforcement, and military-style vests with no visible ID. One held a clipboard. The other had a body cam strapped to his chest. Martha heard them before she saw them. Boots on concrete, loud, purposeful, out of place. She stood and asked carefully, "Can I help you?" One of the men barked, "You've been cited for porch violations, unauthorized items in plain view. This is your final warning before escalation." Martha flinched, confused. I don't understand. This is my home. I've had the same plants and swing since—" "Doesn't matter," the man with the clipboard snapped. "HOA Code 14.6. You're in violation. You need to remove the swing, the wind chimes, and the ceramic owl." She reached for her cane to step down and feel around the porch. An instinctive, cautious move for someone with her disability. The second man shouted, "Hands where I can see them!" And before she could even process the words, he pulled out a small canister and sprayed her directly in the face. Martha let out a guttural cry. Her tea shattered. The cane clattered to the wood. She fell back into the railing, clutching her face as the stinging pain overwhelmed her. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The burn crawled across her cheeks like fire ants. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, shaking, humiliated beyond words. Across the street, a neighbor screamed. Another yelled to call 911. Someone rushed to record with a phone, but the two men were already walking off, laughing, like they'd just finished a prank. One of them muttered, "Complain again, and we'll come back with a tow truck." No one stopped them. They disappeared in their black SUV, leaving behind a shattered teacup, a woman trembling on her knees, and a neighborhood too stunned to move. Martha lay there for nearly 2 minutes before anyone dared approach her, blinded not just by the spray, but by a world that had turned hostile without warning. And that was how the fight began. When Adam Ellison's phone rang that Sunday afternoon, he was reviewing a federal policy draft in his Tallahassee office. His first week on the job, the call came from a neighbor's number he didn't recognize, and he nearly ignored it. But when he answered and heard the panic in the woman's voice, heard the words, "Your mother," attacked, and they sprayed her, everything else stopped. He drove 3 hours in under 2. By the time he reached the hospital in Clearwater, his hands were shaking, but not from fear, from fury. When he walked into the emergency room and saw his mother's face, the air left his lungs. Martha's eyes were nearly swollen shut. Her skin was red and inflamed across her cheeks and nose. She was wearing a hospital gown and holding his childhood scarf, the one she'd kept in her purse for 20 years, just in case. Her voice was hoarse, but her words were clear. "They said they were from the HOA, Adam. They just showed up, like police." Adam knelt beside her and gently took her hand. He didn't ask more questions. Not yet. He just sat still, breathing through clenched teeth, silently counting the seconds. 20 years in law and public service had taught him how to control his emotions, but nothing in law school prepared him for this. Once Martha was resting, he pulled the hospital curtain aside and stepped out. He made 3 calls in 15 minutes, one to the Clearwater PD, one to the local sheriff's office, and one to a private contact in state-level law enforcement. The preliminary facts were worse than he imagined. No report had been filed, no officers dispatched. The HOA compliance team wasn't registered with any law enforcement body, no names, no badge numbers, no citations, just a couple of men in tactical vests driving a rented SUV with a magnetic HOA logo slapped on the side. Adam drove to Pine Brook Lane that same evening. Neighbors were still buzzing, some shaken, some angry, others unsure whether it had all been a mistake. A few had already deleted their footage after receiving courtesy calls from the HOA. Adam walked straight to the office of Gerald Kincaid, the HOA president, whose face carried the smug calm of a man used to being feared more than questioned. Gerald met him with a smile that faded when Adam introduced himself. "Mr. Ellison, I'm so sorry about what happened to your mother. Truly," he said, leaning back in his chair, "but I don't know who those individuals were. We've been dealing with a few third-party enforcement contractors, so I wouldn't read too much into this. Sometimes people get a little too enthusiastic." Adam said nothing at first, just looked at him, studied the tidy desk, the framed college football jersey on the wall, the Rolex, the smell of cologne over stale authority. Gerald chuckled awkwardly. "Look, if I can be frank, you'd be doing everyone a favor by not making this a spectacle. These things tend to spiral. You know how social media works." Adam gave him a long, unreadable look. Then he smiled, just slightly. "Of course," he said. "I wouldn't want to make a scene. That's not my style." What Gerald didn't know, what no one in that office or in that county or in the entire subdivision of Pine Brook knew, was that Adam wasn't just Martha Ellison's son. He was the newly appointed Attorney General for the state of Florida. He had full authority to investigate impersonation of law enforcement, abuse of civil rights, and racketeering. And unlike the men who had assaulted his mother, his badge wasn't printed on a polo shirt. It was backed by the state. And by the time this was over, Gerald would remember exactly what that meant. Adam Ellison didn't sleep that night. He didn't need to. By sunrise on Monday, he'd already put together a private task group of legal analysts, investigators, and digital forensics experts from the Office of the Attorney General. No press releases, no public statements, just quiet calls and encrypted folders passed between trusted hands. The first break came fast. The SUV captured on a neighbor's Ring camera bore temporary Florida plates, rented just 2 days earlier under a holding company called SunTrail Logistics LLC. On paper, it was a transport business. In reality, it was a shell, one of 4 connected to a private security outfit called Blue Coast Asset Protection. The owner, Marcus Lerner, brother-in-law to none other than Gerald Kincaid. From there, the dominoes fell in sequence. Adam's team cross-referenced HOA newsletters going back 6 months. They found subtle but telling language, lines about voluntary enforcement partners, compliance coordination, and external contractors assisting with order preservation. Not illegal on its face, but vague enough to hide a structure behind which the HOA board could authorize informal patrols without real accountability. Next came the footage. Neighbors who'd been intimidated into silence started sending video clips once Adam personally called them, not as Martha's son, but as the top law enforcement official in the state. Some footage showed the 2 fake officers pounding on doors, shouting legal jargon that didn't exist. One clip showed them taping official notices to a mailbox, despite that being a federal offense. Another caught them bragging about finally shutting up the owl lady, laughing like it was a joke. But what made the case bulletproof was audio. A mic on one neighbor's home camera had picked up the phrase, "Don't worry, Gerald said we've got cover. These people don't push back." That was the thread, and Adam pulled it hard. Within 72 hours, a full report was compiled detailing a coordinated operation of unauthorized security activities, impersonation of public officials, unlawful detainment, and civil rights violations. Adam signed off on a multi-agency warrant, personally coordinating with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, and a state prosecutor from his own division. On Friday morning, Pine Brook Lane awoke to a very different kind of HOA visit. Marked vehicles rolled into the subdivision in convoy. Agents fanned out across the cul-de-sac, executing the warrant with the kind of precision and authority that left no room for questions. Doors weren't knocked on. They were answered under pressure. The same two men who had sprayed an elderly woman on her own porch were found lounging in a rented townhouse 4 blocks away. They tried to talk fast. One claimed he was just following instructions. The other said it was part of a training simulation. Neither of them had credentials. Neither had a defense. They were cuffed on the spot and walked out in front of the same neighbors they'd once intimidated. This time, nobody looked afraid. Gerald Kincaid was detained without incident. He didn't say a word as he was escorted from his office, but his expression spoke volumes. Disbelief that someone like him could be touched. Adam stood by the state vehicle, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded to his lead agent and turned away. Because in his world, justice didn't come with sirens and applause. It came with evidence and handcuffs. Justice didn't come quickly, but it came thoroughly. Within 2 weeks, Gerald Kincaid was indicted on multiple felony charges, including conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement, misuse of HOA funds, and racketeering. Investigators uncovered a trail of emails, payments, and quietly altered meeting minutes that painted a clear picture. Gerald had orchestrated a backdoor enforcement scheme designed to bypass real law enforcement while exerting unchecked authority over residents he deemed problematic. The two so-called compliance officers faced their own reckoning. With a stack of video evidence and witness statements in hand, the state filed charges of aggravated assault, unlawful detainment, and impersonation of public officials. Both men pled guilty in exchange for reduced sentences, but the judge made it clear this wasn't just about punishment. It was about setting precedent. "This court," she said, "will not tolerate private citizens dressing themselves in authority they do not possess, especially when it leads to the harm of vulnerable members of our community." Martha Ellison didn't attend the sentencing. Her doctor said she needed rest, and Adam agreed. But that didn't stop her name from echoing through the rotunda of the state capitol 3 weeks later. At a small but powerful ceremony, she was honored as a symbol of dignity, courage, and the quiet resilience that so often goes unrecognized. The governor presented her with a civilian medal for service to justice, not because she fought back, but because she held her ground when others would have backed away. The audience rose in a standing ovation as she accepted the medal, wearing a soft blue dress and dark glasses, her son beside her. Adam stood a few feet back as the cameras flashed. He hadn't sought attention. He didn't want a press tour or headlines. But when one reporter caught up with him afterwards and asked, "What made you fight so hard, so fast?" he paused, just for a moment, and gave a measured reply. "You don't pepper spray my mother and walk away," he said. "Not in my state." The clip went viral by nightfall. In the weeks that followed, HOA boards across the state were put under review. New legislation was drafted, regulating the use of third-party security contractors in residential communities. At town halls and homeowner meetings, people began to speak more boldly, less afraid of retaliation. Neighbors who once whispered about unfair treatment now raised their voices, knowing someone was listening. Martha eventually returned to Pine Brook Lane, but not before Adam had her porch fully rebuilt, swing and all, with her name carved into the wood. She sat there most evenings, sipping tea again, wind chimes gently swaying in the breeze. The ceramic owl stayed exactly where it had always been, and the next time someone walked up her path, they came with flowers, not threats,